could think of the ego as being the idea of separation. Both Buddhism and A Course in Miracles would agree that the fastest way to salvation is to undo the ego. That's why the Course teaches that salvation is undoing. And the beauty of that is that if you were to undo the ego, the idea of separation, the idea that you have somehow taken on a personal identity and a separate existence from your source, if you were to do that, then eventually the real you would be all that's left.
The ego is a Course term for a thought system. I think it's important to understand that even though the Course talks about the ego as if it were a thing, in fact, at one place in chapter 4 of the text, Jesus basically apologizes for talking about the ego as if it were a separate thing, almost like the devil, even though the Course doesn't believe in the devil. But the ego is not a thing. The ego really is our decision maker's decision to embrace a thought system of separation and individuality and guilt and attack. So the ego is really not an entity in and of itself. The ego is simply a thought that we have made real by virtue of our belief in it.
You're already perfect. You don't have to struggle to be what you already are. You already are the same as God. You already are this perfect spirit that is immortal and invulnerable. All that you have to do is undo the false you, undo the ego, and eventually the experience of the real you will be there, for you.
The ego, once again, is nothing more than our belief in it. And the hour that believes in it is the decision-making part of our mind that wants to be on its own, wants to be independent, autonomous, and be totally separated from God and His love. That's what the ego is. And this is extremely important in terms of how one practices the Course. There's a very important line that says, into eternity where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. What that makes clear is that the problem was not the tiny mad idea, and then by extrapolation, not any of the fragmentary shadows, namely our perceptual universe of that tiny mad idea. The problem is that we took it seriously. That's what it means to remember not to laugh. By taking it seriously, we said this is real and is a problem, and we have to do something about it. That's exactly what the ego does. That's exactly what most formal religions do, and unfortunately, it's actually what most spiritualities have done. They make the thought system of the ego real no matter how they conceptualize it, and then they have a plan to kind of deal with it. What makes the Course different is that it says the ego is never the problem. How could what doesn't exist, what never happened, be a problem? The problem is that we took it seriously. We remembered not to laugh at it. So what this means in terms of our practical living, our everyday life, is that we become aware when we choose the ego, by recognizing when we're disquieted, when we're upset, when we're not totally at peace, when we exclude certain members of the sonship from our love and our forgiveness. And when we become aware of that, not to be upset, not to feel guilty over having done this, but recognize what we have chosen, what the consequences of that choice are, namely that I will not be happy and I will not be peaceful. And that's what will motivate me to choose again.
If you get down to that last layer of ego and you undo it, then eventually the experience of your perfect oneness with your source or God or whatever you want to call it is going to be there as a permanent reality. So that's a beautiful approach. It's a classic approach. It's not the approach that everybody uses, but it's definitely the approach of both Buddhism and A Course in Miracles.